There is a moment just before a storm breaks when the world holds its breath. A quiet so profound it feels like a promise or a threat. That was the air in the courtroom as the defense lawyer rose, my sketches held in her hand not as art, but as a weapon. Each page a chapter in a secret history. Each charcoal line a testament to a truth only I had seen. I felt a sense of rightness settle over me, a fierce, fragile hope that the dust on my fingers was about to redraw the lines of justice. This, I told myself, was the purpose of my inheritance, not just to see, but to make others see with me. She began with Elena Vance, the grieving partner, whose sorrow had always seemed too perfect, too polished. The questions were not accusations, but soft, steady pressures applied to the cracks in a flawless facade. The lawyer laid out my drawings one by one before the jury, a storyboard of another man's soul. "Look here," her calm voice seemed to say, "at the moment her name is spoken. See how the mask shifts." Elena's composure, once a marble statue of mourning, began to show its fractures. A tightening of the jaw here, a flicker of something cold and hard in her eyes there. But my own gaze, as always, was fixed on Julian Croft. With every mention of Elena, with every sketch revealed, the tremor in his hand returned. It was no longer a subtle whisper I had to hunt for. It was a desperate, silent scream. He wasn't watching the lawyer or the witness or the jury. He was watching a story unravel, a story he had tried to bury in the tomb of his own body. He was watching the ghost he had carried for months finally take form in the unforgiving light of the court. And then it happened. Not with a shout, but with a sound that tore through the sanctified silence. A sound of utter human breakage. Julian Croft fell apart. The collapse was not gradual, it was seismic. The carefully constructed man of power and poise, the icon of untouchable calm, disintegrated in an instant. All that was left was the raw, ruined architecture of a lie. His body convulsed with a sob that seemed to come from the very bedrock of his being, a sound of such profound agony it silenced every other breath in the room. The confession that followed was not a sequence of words, but a torrent of poisoned truth, flooding the sterile chamber with the desperate, messy reality of it all. It was not his wife's murder he confessed to. It was something deeper, more entangled, more tragic. The affair, whispered in secret, the fury of a lover discovered, the sudden, blinding rage of Elena Vance, and the fatal blow that followed. He confessed to his own crime, the desperate, damning act of shielding the woman he loved. He hadn't been covering up a crime to save himself. He had been covering it up to save her. In that moment, my own world tilted on its axis. The tremor I had so diligently chronicled, it was not the vibration of a man's fear of being caught. It was the frantic, overloaded pulse of his guilt, the unbearable weight of a secret, not out of cowardice, but out of a love so absolute it had chosen damnation over betrayal. I had been so sure. I had seen the truth in his hands, but I had read its language all wrong. He was not a man afraid of the killer. He was a man destroyed by his love for her. The story I thought I was telling of a wronged man and a hidden culprit vanished like a sketch in the rain. In its place, a far darker and more sorrowful tale emerged, one of love and complicity, of a shared and desolate ruin. The law had its murderer now, but justice felt like a hollow word, a distant, sterile concept. My charcoal lines had not led to a simple truth, but to the devastating heart of a complex one. I had traced the shape of a man's conscience, only to find it was a map to someone else's sin. My father once told me that a face is a map of the life you want the world to see. A carefully curated landscape of pleasant hills and placid lakes. But the hands, he would say, his own, stained with a rainbow of pigments, the hands are the raw, untamed geology beneath. They are the fault lines, the seismic truths. He was the most celebrated portraitist of his generation until the day his search for truth in a subject's eyes revealed something the world wasn't ready to see. His fall from grace was a cautionary tale whispered in galleries and art schools, a lesson in the danger of looking too closely. That legacy is a ghost at my own easel, a weight in the charcoal I hold. Every artist inherits something. Some inherit a fortune, others a style. I inherited a burden, the relentless need to see. Not just to look, but to truly see, to peel back the layers of performance and find the trembling heart of the matter. It's what makes me good at this job, and what makes this job a private kind of hell. The courtroom is a theater of managed truths, and my role is to be a silent, objective witness, to capture the proceedings, not the souls. Robert, the veteran reporter who took me under his wing, has skin like worn leather and a cynicism polished to a high sheen by decades of watching justice be dispensed like a vending machine commodity. He'd warned me when I first started, his voice a gravelly murmur over the courtroom hum. "Don't get involved," he'd said. "We're here to record the story, not to write it. You draw the mask, kid, not the man behind it. It's a job of lines and shade, not emotion. To feel is to fail." But I had seen the tremor, a flicker, a barely there vibration in Julian Croft's perfectly manicured hand as the prosecution displayed a photograph of a broken locket. It was a tremor no one else saw, a flaw in the marble statue of composure he presented to the world. And now I can't unsee it. Back in my small apartment, the sterile air of the courtroom is replaced by the scent of turpentine and fixative, a fragrance that is both comfort and accusation. The room is filled with ghosts of my father's work, and the echo of his failure pushes me onward. The official sketches for the media are done, filed, and forgotten, but my private work has just begun. My floor is littered with discarded attempts, a graveyard of paper. It's the hands, only the hands. I am possessed by them. I draw them over and over, trying to capture that single ephemeral moment. The sketchpad becomes a battlefield. My charcoal is a desperate weapon, chasing a ghost. I render the elegant fingers, the clean, confident lines of a man who built an empire. I shade the subtle tension in the knuckles, the way they rest on the polished oak of the defendant's table, feigning a calm they do not possess. But the tremor eludes me. Each failed drawing feels like a personal failing, a betrayal of the one gift my father gave me. I can render Croft's placid face in my sleep, the handsome, hollow mask of a man wronged. But his hands tell a different story, a frantic, whispered confession I can't quite decipher. It's a vibration of something deeper than guilt. It isn't the fear of a guilty man caught in a lie. It's something else, something colder. It's the quaking of a soul under a pressure I cannot name. Robert's warning rings in my ears. I am getting involved. I am no longer just an observer. I am an interrogator, and my only tools are paper and graphite. I am not drawing what is there, but what I feel is there. I am projecting, imagining, building a narrative from a single stolen second. Perhaps my father's sin wasn't seeing too much, but wanting to see something that wasn't there at all. Yet I cannot stop. I pin the best of the failures to my wall, an obsessive collage of knuckles and wrists. They stare back at me, a silent chorus of unanswered questions. They are not just hands anymore. They are a lock, And I am becoming convinced that somewhere in the sterile theater of the courtroom, I will find the key. I am no longer drawing a man, but a mystery. And every line I press into the page is a search for the trigger, the one word, the one name that made the earth beneath him begin to shake. The obsession had taken root. The charcoal sticks felt less like tools and more like extensions of my own nervous system, attuned to a frequency no one else in the room could hear. The trial droned on, a liturgy of forensics and finance, of timelines and telephone records. The prosecution built its case brick by meticulous brick, a fortress of logic with Julian Croft sealed inside. But I wasn't watching the architecture of the argument, I was watching the man. My gaze drifted from his face, which remained a mask of weary composure, and returned, always, to his hands. They rested on the polished wood of the defendant's box, one laid over the other, a sculpture of feigned calm. Days bled together, a wash of gray suits and the low hum of courtroom air conditioning. My sketchbook filled with the same image, rendered over and over, Croft's hands, captured in that fleeting moment of vibration. My mentor's warning echoed in my mind, a quiet voice cautioning me against the undertow of emotion. But this wasn't emotion, this was a pattern, a rhythm, a terrible, silent metronome counting out a beat only I could perceive. And then the pattern acquired a name. It was spoken without fanfare by a witness on the stand, a corporate accountant detailing company holdings. The name was Elena Vance, the victim's business partner, a woman who sat in the second row of the gallery each day, a portrait of quiet, unremarkable grief. The moment her name was spoken, it happened, a flicker, a barely perceptible shiver that ran through Croft's light hand before he tightened his left over it, pressing the tremor into submission. I froze, my charcoal hovering over the page. A coincidence, perhaps, a stray nerve, but my eyes were now fixed, waiting. An hour later, during cross-examination, the defense lawyer mentioned her again, questioning a shared investment. And again the signal came, a brief seismic shudder, a ghost of motion instantly suppressed. From that moment on, the trial became a different story. I was no longer just an artist, I was a decoder, listening for a single word in a sea of legal jargon. Every mention of a stock portfolio, a business lunch, a corporate retreat, I held my breath. But the tremor remained dormant. It was only the name, Elena Vance, a key turning a lock deep inside Julian Croft. It was the only thing that could breach the walls of his control. A new truth began to bloom in my mind, terrifying and insistent. This wasn't the tremor of a man fearing his own guilt. A guilty man fears the evidence, the witnesses, the closing arguments that will seal his fate. Croft was unmoved by all of it. He only flinched at the mention of the grieving partner. I looked from the defendant's box to the second row, where Elena Vance sat, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, the very picture of sorrow. But I no longer saw a mourner, I saw a shadow. And Croft was the one living in it. The story was wrong. He wasn't the killer. He was afraid of the killer. The weight of this conviction was immense, a physical pressure in my chest. I had to tell someone. The law saw a murderer. I saw a hostage. During a recess, my heart hammering against my ribs, I approached the lead defense attorney. My sketchbook felt heavy in my hands, a folio of forbidden knowledge. I tried to explain, my voice low and urgent, showing him the series of drawings, the hands placid, then trembling, then placid again, pointing out the transcript pages where her name appeared. He listened with a strained patience, his eyes glancing at my sketches as if they were fanciful doodles. When I finished, a small, patronizing smile touched his lips. He told me I had a wonderful eye for detail, a powerful sensibility. And then came the blow, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly. He said I was letting my imagination run away with me, that I was seeing ghosts in the machine, that this was a court of law, not a gallery for overwrought interpretations. I stood there, the sound of the courtroom corridor buzzing around me, but all I could hear was the echo of his dismissal. He had not just rejected my observation, he had invalidated my sight. The very gift my father had given me, the ability to see what lies beneath the surface, was now branded a liability, a flaw. The fortress of the official story had cast me out, leaving me utterly alone on the other side of the wall. The work that had felt like a calling now felt like a curse, one that could cost me my reputation, my job. He walked away, leaving me with my charcoal truths, now rendered as worthless as dust. The law had its story, but my sketches knew another, a story written not in ink, but in terror. Rejection has a sound. It isn't the sharp slam of a door, but the soft, final click of a lock you can no longer open. It is the hollow echo in an empty hallway, the rustle of papers that carry a verdict before a trial has even ended. The city, once a canvas of possibilities, now felt like a gallery of closed doors. My art, the one true thing I inherited, had been branded as fantasy. My sight, a curse. Rejection has a sound. It isn't the sharp slam of a door, but the soft, final click of a lock you can no longer open. It is the hollow echo in an empty hallway, the rustle of papers that carry a verdict before a trial has even ended. The city, once a canvas of possibilities, now felt like a gallery of closed doors. My art, the one true thing I inherited, had been branded as fantasy. My sight, a curse. I returned to my sanctuary of paper and dust, the scent of charcoal a bitter incense. The world had told me I was wrong, that I was chasing ghosts in the lines of a man's face. But the ghosts were persistent. They lived in the sheaf of sketches I had accumulated, a silent, damning chorus. In my mind, I saw Julian Croft, not as the world saw him, a composed monster or a tragic hero, but as a man caught in an invisible current, pulled under by a force no one else could perceive. Words had failed me. They were blunt instruments, unable to carve out the delicate truth I saw. So I let my hands speak the language they knew best. I worked not with anger, but with a desperate, quiet clarity. I didn't create a new drawing. I curated the truth I had already captured. One by one, I pulled the sketches from the portfolio, spreading them across the worn wood of my floor. It was no longer a collection. It was a sequence, a story. Here, the prosecution presents a timeline. Croft's face is a mask of stoic calm, his hands resting, still. Here, a witness describes the crime scene. His jaw is tight, but his composure is a fortress. But then, the next sketch, the first mention of her name, Elena. And there it is, the flicker in the eye, the subtle intake of breath that doesn't quite fill the lungs. The portrait of a man listening to a name that means more than a business partnership. Another sketch. The prosecutor asks about Elena's relationship with the victim. And again, the tremor, a seismic event on a microscopic scale, vibrating from the knuckles down to the wrist. I had drawn it a dozen times, a frantic attempt to understand its rhythm. Now, laid out in order, the rhythm became a narrative. It was a silent film playing out on paper, each drawing a frame, each twitch a line of dialogue only I could read. The subject wasn't murder, it was fear, a deep, abiding terror that had a name. With the storyboard complete, I walked back into the lion's den. The defense attorney's office was a shrine to logic, all polished mahogany and the weight of leather-bound books. His skepticism met me at the door, a cold front I had felt before. He prepared to dismiss me again. I could see it in the weary set of his shoulders. But this time, I offered no words. I simply laid the charcoal panels on his desk, arranging them in the precise sequence I had rehearsed in my mind. The first sketch, the second, the third. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and new doubt. His eyes, which had glanced over my previous work with polite disinterest, now followed the progression. He traced the narrative from one frame to the next, his gaze sharp, analytical. He saw the impassive face, and then the subtle fracturing of that composure. He saw the still hands, and then the ghost of a tremor. He was no longer looking at art. He was reading a confession, not of guilt, but of something far more complex. He was seeing the pattern, the trigger, the undeniable link between a name and a man's unraveling. He touched the edge of the final sketch, the one where Croft's fear was most palpable, his fingers smudging the charcoal dust as if to feel the vibration I had captured. He did not apologize for his disbelief. Men like him never do. But he looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time. In his eyes, I saw the dawning of a terrible possibility. A single, slow nod was his answer. It was enough. A breath I didn't know I was holding escaped my lungs. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something more fragile, hope, a dangerous, beautiful thing. The belief that my charcoal and paper had done more than capture a likeness. They had passed a sentence of their own. They had pointed the law toward a new shadow, a new name to be whispered in the halls of justice. I had given a witness a voice, a truth, a shape. And now, that shape was beginning to move on its own, stepping out from the paper and into the world, walking toward a truth I only thought I understood. There is a specific kind of silence that falls just before a story breaks, a breathless hush where the air itself seems to hold a question. For Sophia, this was it. Hope, she was learning, is a fragile instrument, easily played, but just as easily shattered. She sat with her charcoal poised, watching as the lawyer laid her sketches before the court, not as exhibits, but as a timeline of a lie. One by one, they were revealed, a flipbook of a man's unraveling, a visual diary of a hidden terror. The courtroom watched, but Sophia watched the faces. She watched the jury, their eyes tracing the frantic lines of her work. She watched the judge, whose expression remained a mask of practiced neutrality. But most of all, she watched Elena Vance. Elena, who had been a creature of shadow and quiet grief, was now held in the unforgiving light of the witness stand. The sketches were presented to her, each one a mirror reflecting a moment she was not supposed to have mattered. Croft's calm facade, the subtle introduction of her name into the record, and then the tremor, captured in a flurry of dark, energetic strokes. The lawyer's voice was a low, steady pressure, asking questions that were not about murder, but about influence, about presence, about the power one person can hold over another. And with every question, a fine, invisible crack appeared in Elena's porcelain composure. Her grief, once so convincing, began to look like a performance, its edges fraying under the scrutiny of Sophia's art. Sophia felt a rising tide of vindication. This was it, the moment her vision, her obsession, would pull the truth from the depths. She had seen the fear in Croft, and now the court was finally seeing its source. But the break, when it came, did not come from the witness stand. It came from the defendant's chair. A sound, not a word, but the choked, splintering sound of a man coming apart. All eyes snapped to Julian Croft. The tremor, the ghost that had lived in the delicate space between his thumb and forefinger, was no longer a subtle twitch. It had been unleashed. It was an earthquake radiating from the center of his being, a violent shudder that shook his shoulders, his jaw, his entire frame. The dam of his composure did not just crack, it disintegrated in a single catastrophic moment. He rose, unsteady, a man drowning on dry land, and the story that spilled from him was not the one anyone was prepared to hear. It was a confession, but not to murder. It was a confession to love, a desperate, ruinous love for the woman on the stand. He spoke of stolen nights and whispered promises, of a life he planned to build with Elena, away from the one he already had. The courtroom, once a theater of justice, became a confessional. The victim, his wife, was no longer just a name on a legal file. She was the woman who had discovered their betrayal. And in that moment of discovery, the truth of her death was finally revealed. It was not a calculated act of a jealous husband. It was a flash of rage, a moment of violent, panicked fury. But the hand that struck the blow was not his. It was Elena's. The silence that followed was heavier, deeper than before. It was the silence of utter shock. Croft had not been covering for a killer he feared. He had been shielding the woman he loved. His silence was not a cage built by intimidation, but a sanctuary built by guilt. The guilt of his own betrayal and the guilt of her crime, which he had absorbed as his own. And the tremor? Sophia finally understood. It was never fear of a prison cell. It was the physical manifestation of a soul groaning under an impossible weight. It was the vibration of a secret kept not for self-preservation, but for a devastating, misplaced devotion. Every time Elena's name was mentioned, the guilt pulsed through him, a current of silent agony his body could no longer contain. He was not afraid of Elena. He was drowning in his love for her. Sophia's charcoal slipped from her fingers. The neat, linear story she had drawn of a powerful man terrified of his accomplice was a child's tale compared to this. She had seen the truth of the tremor, but had been utterly blind to its heart. She had unearthed a fact, but missed the epic, twisted tragedy that gave it life. The edifice of the trial had collapsed, and in the rubble, two truths lay exposed. One was of a murder. The other, far more complex, was of a love that had become its own kind of weapon. The verdict was in, long before the jury could ever speak, written not in ink, but in the ruins of two broken people. The gavel fell not like a crack of thunder, but like the sound of the world breaking. A fault line ran through the polished wood of the courtroom, and everything tilted on its axis. The air, once thick with suspense, shattered into a million sharp fragments of noise, gasps, shouts, the frantic scribbling of pens that were not my own. But for me, there was only a profound and hollow silence, the kind you hear in the moments after a devastating impact when your senses refuse to process the wreckage. I had been so sure. The lines I drew were a language I thought I understood, a secret code between the truth and my charcoal. I had followed the tremor in Julian Croft's hand like a map, convinced it led to a hidden monster. I was right, I was wrong. The monster was real, but it wore a different face. The tremor was not fear of a killer. It was the unbearable vibration of a guilty love, a secret so heavy it made the very bones of his hand tremble with its weight. Across the room, Elena Vance's composure, that elegant mask of sorrow she had worn so perfectly, did not just crack. It dissolved. It melted away under the heat of 100 staring eyes, revealing the raw, ugly thing beneath, not grief, but cornered fury. In that single horrifying moment, I saw the truth of my own art. I had captured the shape of the darkness, but I had given it the wrong name. My sketches, laid out before the court, were no longer instruments of justice. They were a confession, coaxed from the wrong soul. Julian's own confession had emptied him. He was a hollowed-out thing. The weight of his lie finally lifted, only to be replaced by the crushing gravity of the truth. He was not an innocent man wrongly accused. He was a man shackled by a different kind of guilt, a participant in a tragedy of his own making. The hero I had tried to sketch into existence was a figment, a ghost drawn from my own desire for a simpler story. My own hands felt foreign, resting on the sketchbook. They had felt so powerful just hours before, capable of revealing what the law could not see. Now they felt clumsy, reckless. This gift of sight, the legacy my father had passed down, suddenly felt like a dangerous weapon. I had aimed it with the best of intentions, but it had detonated in ways I could never have imagined, showering everyone with a truth more complicated and more painful than the lie it replaced. As the chaos swirled around me, a familiar presence settled beside me, a quiet anchor in the storm of my own making. My mentor didn't need to say a word. His silence was a language I understood. It spoke of the brutal ambiguities of this world, the one that existed beyond the clean lines of my paper. It reminded me of what he had always tried to teach me, that you can see a thing with perfect clarity and still not understand it at all. You had seen the truth, his quiet gaze seemed to say. You just weren't prepared for what that truth really was. The courtroom slowly emptied, the noise receding like a painful tide, leaving behind the debris of shattered lives. I was left alone with my drawings. They were no longer just sketches of a man's hands. They were the topography of a broken heart, a map of a poisoned conscience. I had come here to draw a man's trial, to capture the objective facts in strokes of graphite, but I had done something else entirely. I had drawn the architecture of human ruin, and I feared its foundations were now built inside of me. The noise of the trial had faded, its echoes finally absorbed by the city's relentless hum. Weeks fell away, not like calendar pages torn in haste, but like autumn leaves drifting into quiet piles, each one a day of settled dust. I found my way back to the parks, to the public squares, to the anonymous currents of life that flow beneath the headlines. My charcoal found its way back to the paper, but the lines were different now. The sharp, accusatory angles I had hunted for in the courtroom had softened into curves. The frantic cross-hatching that once sought to capture a lie had been replaced by a gentler shading, one that seemed more interested in light than in shadow. I sketched a mother tying her child's shoelace, the patient bend of her back a story in itself. I drew an old man feeding pigeons, the scattering of seeds from his wrinkled palm a kind of silent prayer. The weight of judgment was gone from my wrist. I was no longer an interrogator with a piece of graphite, but simply a witness again. A witness to the small, unremarked gestures that hold a life together. I thought I had left the world of secrets and lies behind, that my work was done. And then the past found me. It arrived without ceremony in the afternoon mail, a single, plain envelope tucked between bills and advertisements. It felt impossibly thin, yet it landed in my hand with the gravity of a stone. There was no flourish to the handwriting, just a simple address. But it was the postmark, the institutional stamp from a state penitentiary that made the air in my small apartment grow still. The return address was a string of numbers and a name I thought I had left behind in the echo of a gavel's fall, Julian Croft. My fingers, so steady now in the park, trembled as they broke the seal, a tremor I knew all too well. The single folded page inside was covered in a neat, measured script, the words carefully formed as if each one had been weighed before being committed to paper. I braced myself for recrimination, for a final, desperate claim of innocence, perhaps even a threat. But his words were not what I expected. There was no plea for pity, no lingering echo of defiance. He wrote of the silence of his cell, a quiet that was louder than any courtroom accusation. A quiet where a man is left with nothing but the architecture of his own choices. He thanked me, not for my part in his exoneration from a murder he did not commit, but for my unflinching gaze upon the truth he had tried so desperately to hide. He wrote that every day of that trial, he felt my eyes on him, not as a judge, but as something far more unnerving, an artist, someone who was not just looking at the facts, but searching for the form, the composition of his soul. In my sketches, he said, he saw not a monster, but a man drowning in a secret he had sworn to keep out of a misguided, ruinous love. He saw the tremor not as a sign of fear, but as the physical manifestation of a conscience tearing itself apart. The paper felt thin and fragile in my hands, a membrane between his world and mine. Then I read the line that would forever change the way I saw my own art, the way I saw the world. "You didn't just draw my hands," he wrote. "You drew my conscience." Victory feels sharp, clean. This was not that. This was a heavy, intricate tapestry of sorrow and release. I had set out to find a simple truth, guilty or not guilty, a binary code written in charcoal. But the truth I had uncovered was not a clean line. It was a tangle of love, guilt, sacrifice, and profound weakness. A human truth. My father had painted faces, searching for the soul behind the eyes. I had painted hands and found the same thing. I stood at my window, the letter resting on the sill, and looked out at the city. The courtroom had delivered a verdict, but the story was so much larger than that. The law had found a culprit. My art had found a man. There was no triumph in my reflection in the glass, only a quiet, somber understanding. The lines I drew from that day forward would carry a different kind of weight. Not the weight of evidence, but the weight of empathy. Art, I was beginning to understand, is not a weapon for justice. It is a mirror, and sometimes its most profound revelation is not in exposing the monster, but in finding the broken, complicated, and terribly fragile human being within.